The grand ballroom of the National Convention Center glistened under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers. Rows of suited men and women filled the room, their murmured conversations rising like a low hum against the backdrop of clinking glasses and the occasional polite laugh. This was the political event of the season, a gathering of the elite to celebrate the party's achievements and solidify the image of unity and moral leadership. At the head of the room, the podium stood as a beacon of authority, its polished wood reflecting the cascading lights. Behind it sat Alexander Hawthorne, the charismatic politician who had built his career on his reputation as a devoted family man. His silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes exuded confidence, and his tailored suit added to his air of perfection. His wife, Catherine, the epitome of grace and loyalty, sat beside him, her auburn hair neatly pulled into a chignon. She wore a calm smile that mirrored her husband's, but anyone watching closely might have noticed the stiffness in her posture. Alexander leaned over, whispering to one of his aides, as the evening's keynote speaker prepared to take the stage. The room dimmed slightly, signaling the audience to quiet down. All eyes turned toward the woman walking toward the podium. She was striking, not in the expected glamorous way, but with a quiet, commanding presence that drew attention. Her dark brown hair was tied into a sleek bun, and her light brown skin seemed to glow under the lights. She wore a fitted navy dress that highlighted her pregnancy, her movements deliberate as she approached the microphone. The murmurs in the room ceased. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn Grace began, her voice steady and clear, "I thank you for giving me this platform tonight." Alexander's smile faltered for the briefest moment. His eyes darted toward Evelyn, his expression tightening as if bracing for something. Beside him, Catherine tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing. Evelyn continued, her words deliberate, slicing through the air like a blade. "I have come here tonight not just to speak about the work we do, but to speak the truth." There was a slight shift in the audience. Whispers began to ripple through the rows, curiosity thick in the air. Evelyn's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Alexander, whose knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table in front of him. "For too long," Evelyn said, her voice growing stronger, "I have hidden the truth about a man who many of you hold in the highest regard. But tonight, I can no longer remain silent." The room fell into an oppressive silence. Even the air seemed to still. "I am pregnant," she said, pausing to let her words sink in. "And the father of my child is Alexander Hawthorne." The ballroom erupted. Gasps echoed, followed by a cacophony of whispers, some shocked, others accusatory. Catherine's carefully composed expression shattered, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to her husband, whose face had drained of color. The weight of Evelyn's revelation hung over the room, crushing the carefully constructed facade of Alexander's public life in an instant. And Evelyn, standing tall behind the podium, held her ground. Months before the explosive night at the National Convention Center, Alexander Hawthorne attended a glittering fundraising gala at the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. The ballroom was a spectacle of wealth and power. Gilded mirrors lined the walls, reflecting the soft golden light from opulent chandeliers above. The air buzzed with polite laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes, as Washington's elite exchanged pleasantries and made promises they never intended to keep. Alexander moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and flashing his signature smile. He was in his element here, a masterful orator, a commanding presence. He looked every bit the politician his constituents adored, tall, athletic, with silver streaks in his neatly combed hair that lent him an air of wisdom beyond his years. His tailored tuxedo fit him perfectly, a symbol of the precision with which he controlled every aspect of his life. His wife, Catherine, stood by his side, poised and gracious in a cream-colored gown. Together, they looked like the picture-perfect couple, the embodiment of traditional family values. But even as Alexander nodded and smiled, there was a restlessness in him, an itch he couldn't scratch. He had spent years carefully building his image, sacrificing pieces of himself for the greater political narrative. Tonight, that restlessness grew sharper. That was when he saw her. Evelyn Grace stood at the edge of the room, a quiet contrast to the louder, more ostentatious figures surrounding her. She wore a sleek emerald green dress that hugged her figure, understated yet undeniably striking. Her light brown skin seemed to glow under the warm lighting, and her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders. She wasn't laughing loudly or throwing her arms around the most powerful people in the room. She stood tall, composed, her hazel eyes scanning the crowd with curiosity and calculation. Alexander's curiosity was piqued. He watched her for a moment longer than he should have, something stirring in him that he hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just beautiful, there was a quiet strength in her, a confidence that wasn't tied to the wealth and status everyone else flaunted so openly. He turned to Catherine and murmured an excuse about mingling with donors. Catherine gave him a distracted nod, her attention already shifting to a familiar face approaching her. Alexander made his way toward Evelyn, his pulse quickening. As he neared her, she noticed him and turned, her expression curious but guarded. "Good evening," Alexander said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Evelyn smiled politely, her hazel eyes meeting his. "Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne." "You know who I am," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Of course. You're hard to miss in a room like this." Her voice was steady, unflustered. Alexander found her directness refreshing. "And you are?" he asked. "Evelyn Grace," she replied. "I'm with the Department of Housing and Urban Development." A rather modest role, compared to most of the people here. "Modesty is a virtue," Alexander said, smiling. "Though I doubt you're as modest as you claim." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Hawthorne, or a critique?" Alexander chuckled softly, charmed by her boldness. "A compliment, Ms. Grace." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from professional pleasantries to sharper, more personal exchanges. Alexander found himself captivated by her wit and intelligence, the way she didn't shy away from challenging his views. Evelyn, for her part, saw beyond the polished veneer of a politician and glimpsed the restless man underneath. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin. Catherine had long since retired to another corner of the room, engaged in her own conversations. Alexander and Evelyn lingered, their connection deepening with each word exchanged. When the night finally ended, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave her company. As he stepped into his car, his mind was filled with thoughts of Evelyn. He didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of something that would upend his carefully controlled life, igniting a passion he couldn't resist and a scandal he couldn't escape. In the weeks following the gala, Alexander Hawthorne couldn't get Evelyn Grace out of his mind. She had stirred something in him that he had long suppressed, a yearning for something more than the calculated decisions and endless compromises of his political life. His days were filled with meetings, speeches, and public appearances, his evenings a parade of obligations to Catherine and their two teenage children. Yet, in the quiet moments, his thoughts drifted to her. It wasn't long before he found an excuse to see her again. The first meeting was under the guise of discussing housing policy, something that fell within Evelyn's purview at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Alexander made the call himself, ensuring she was the one assigned to the briefing. When she arrived at his office in the Capitol building, she was professional and poised, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes that she didn't bother to hide. "Ms. Grace," Alexander greeted her with his characteristic charm, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne," Evelyn replied, settling into the chair. She was dressed in a tailored black blazer and skirt, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. She opened her folder, prepared to discuss the details of the housing initiative. "How can I assist you?" But as they talked, the lines between professionalism and something more began to blur. Their discussion of policy turned into a deeper conversation about their ideals, their frustrations with the system, and their aspirations. Alexander was struck by her candor, her refusal to sugarcoat the realities of bureaucracy. Evelyn, in turn, was intrigued by the glimpses of vulnerability behind his polished exterior. It was Alexander who crossed the line first. "You're remarkable, Evelyn," he said softly, leaning slightly forward across the desk. His voice was lower now, more personal. "I've met countless people in this world, but you're different." Evelyn's breath caught for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began, her tone firm yet uncertain, "this feels like a dangerous path to tread." "Perhaps," Alexander admitted, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "But some paths are worth the risk." For a moment, the room felt charged with an unspoken tension. Evelyn, torn between her attraction to him and her own instincts, stood abruptly, gathering her things. "I think we've covered everything, sir. If you need anything further, please contact my office." She left without another word, her heart racing as she walked through the Capitol building's halls. But the seed had been planted, and it wasn't long before Alexander found another excuse to see her. Their second meeting took place at a quiet cafe just outside the city. This time, there was no pretense of work. Alexander was waiting for her at a secluded table, his demeanor more relaxed than usual. Evelyn hesitated at the door, knowing full well what stepping inside meant. But she couldn't deny the pull he had on her. As she sat across from him, their connection deepened. Alexander spoke of his frustrations with the constraints of his public image, while Evelyn shared her own struggles navigating a male-dominated world. It wasn't long before their hands brushed across the table, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through them both. From that point on, their meetings became more frequent. They found solace in each other, a secret escape from the demands of their worlds. But as their affair blossomed, so did the risks. Alexander became increasingly adept at leading a double life, charming his constituents and reassuring his family while slipping away to be with Evelyn. For Evelyn, the affair was intoxicating, but it also left her conflicted. She was drawn to Alexander's charisma and vulnerability, yet she couldn't ignore the moral implications of their actions. Still, she allowed herself to be swept up in the passion, unaware of the storm that was brewing on the horizon. It was a crisp spring morning when Evelyn Grace sat in her small apartment, staring down at the test on her kitchen counter. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated the cramped but tidy space, the quiet hum of city life just beyond the glass. Her heart pounded as she read the result, the reality sinking in: she was pregnant. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. She placed a hand on her stomach, her mind racing. For weeks, she had been consumed by her affair with Alexander Hawthorne, a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered promises. Now, everything had changed. This wasn't just a fling anymore, there were real consequences. Evelyn spent the rest of the day in a fog, her emotions swinging wildly between hope and dread. She wanted to believe Alexander would understand, that he would step up, but the logical part of her knew the risks. He was a married man, a public figure with a reputation to protect. This could destroy him, and possibly her too. The next evening, she decided to tell him. They had planned to meet at a secluded hotel suite in Georgetown, their usual spot away from prying eyes. When she arrived, Alexander was already there, seated in a plush armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand. He stood as she entered, his face lighting up in a way that always managed to disarm her. "Evelyn," he said, crossing the room to greet her. He leaned in for a kiss, but she turned her head slightly, his lips brushing her cheek instead. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but low. Alexander frowned, his brow furrowing as he studied her face. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm pregnant, Alexander." For a moment, the room was silent. Alexander's expression froze, his grip tightening around the glass in his hand. Then, he exhaled sharply, setting the glass down on a nearby table. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice carefully measured. "Yes," Evelyn replied. "I took the test yesterday." Alexander ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, pacing the room. This complicates things. Evelyn felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Complicates things? Is that all you have to say? He stopped and turned to her, his face softening. Evelyn, you know I care about you. But it's not just about us. My career, my family, everything is on the line. And what about me? She shot back. What about our child? Alexander hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I won't abandon you, he said finally. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Whatever you need, money, a place to live, I'll provide it. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I don't need your money, Alexander. I need to know you're in this with me. That you're willing to fight for us. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved back to the armchair, sinking into it as if the weight of the world had suddenly doubled. I'll do what I can, he said quietly. But you have to understand. I can't let this get out. Not now. Evelyn stared at him, her heart sinking. She had hoped for more, but deep down, she wasn't surprised. I'll give you time to figure it out, she said, her voice cold. But I won't wait forever. Alexander looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a mix of guilt and conflict. Thank you, he said softly. I'll fix this. I promise. But as Evelyn left the suite that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander's promises would always be more about protecting himself than supporting her. She had taken a risk, put her trust in him, and now she was beginning to see the cracks in the man she had once believed in. Weeks had passed since Evelyn had told Alexander about the pregnancy, but little had changed. Her days were consumed with work and the quiet, constant awareness of the life growing inside her. Alexander, true to his word, had provided financial support and even helped secure her a promotion within her department, ensuring she had the means to live comfortably. But their relationship felt different now, strained, distant, as though the weight of the secret they shared was slowly pressing them apart. Evelyn sat at her desk in her new office, a modest but well-appointed space in a government building near downtown D.C. The promotion had come with more responsibility and a higher salary, but it had also placed her under increased scrutiny. She couldn't shake the feeling that her colleagues were watching her more closely, whispering behind her back. Rumors traveled fast in their world, and though no one seemed to know the full truth, the whispers were enough to unsettle her. The sound of her phone buzzing snapped her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Alexander. Can we meet tonight? Her stomach tightened. Their meetings had become less frequent, and when they did happen, Alexander seemed distracted, always glancing at his phone or cutting their time short. Still, she agreed, hoping this time would be different. That evening, they met at their usual spot, a quiet hotel suite tucked away in Georgetown. Alexander arrived late, his face lined with tension. He poured himself a drink before sitting across from her, the distance between them palpable. How are you feeling? He asked, his tone perfunctory. I'm fine, Evelyn replied, her voice cool. The baby's fine, too, if that's what you're really asking. Alexander sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Evelyn, you know I care about you. This isn't easy for me either. Isn't it? She shot back. You get to go home to your perfect family every night while I'm the one left to deal with this alone. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. Fair? Evelyn's voice rose. Do you think it's fair that I'm the one who has to hide in the shadows while you parade around like nothing's wrong? Do you even realize what this is doing to me? Alexander looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mix of guilt and frustration. I'm doing the best I can, he said softly. I'm trying to protect you, to protect all of us. Protect us? Evelyn laughed bitterly. No, Alexander. You're trying to protect yourself. Your career, your reputation. That's all that matters to you. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I'll figure this out, Alexander said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I promise. But Evelyn had heard that promise before, and it rang hollow now. She stood, grabbing her coat. "Let me know when you've figured out what that actually means," she said before walking out, leaving Alexander alone with his drink and his thoughts. Back at the Hawthorne family home in Bethesda, Catherine was beginning to grow suspicious. Alexander's late nights, his constant phone calls, the distant look in his eyes, it all pointed to something he wasn't telling her. That evening, as Alexander walked through the front door, she was waiting for him in the kitchen, her arms crossed. "You're late again," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I had a meeting," Alexander replied, avoiding her gaze as he loosened his tie. "Another one?" Catherine pressed. "You've been working late almost every night lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" Alexander froze for a moment, then forced a smile. "Catherine, you know how demanding the campaign is. I'm doing this for us, for the family." But Catherine wasn't convinced. She watched him carefully, her sharp blue eyes searching his face for any sign of the truth. "I hope that's true, Alexander," she said quietly. "Because if it's not, I'd like to know sooner rather than later." As she walked away, Alexander exhaled deeply, his carefully constructed world feeling more fragile by the day. The cracks in his armor were starting to show, and he was running out of time to hold everything together. The sun was setting over Washington, D.C., casting the city in a hazy orange glow as Victor Langston leaned back in his leather chair, studying the documents spread across his desk. Victor was a shrewd and ruthless political rival of Alexander Hawthorne, known for his ability to uncover secrets and exploit weaknesses. Tonight, he believed he'd stumbled upon something extraordinary. An anonymous envelope had been delivered to his campaign headquarters earlier that day, marked only with the words "for your eyes only." Inside was a thin stack of papers, emails, hotel records, and, most damning of all, a photograph of Evelyn Grace stepping into a hotel elevator, visibly pregnant. Standing beside her, with his hand lightly brushing her back, was Alexander Hawthorne. Victor's green eyes glinted with satisfaction as he scanned the evidence. He had long suspected that Hawthorne's public image as a devoted husband and family man was too perfect, too carefully curated. And now, here it was, the Achilles heel he'd been waiting for. He tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind racing. The implications of this were enormous. If he played his cards right, this scandal could destroy Hawthorne's career and hand Victor the advantage he needed to secure his position in the upcoming election. But timing was everything. "Call the team," Victor said to his chief of staff, who stood nearby. "I want a full background check on Evelyn Grace. Find out everything there is to know about her, where she came from, how she got her job, and most importantly, how long this has been going on." The chief of staff nodded, already dialing numbers as Victor leaned forward, poring over the documents again. He couldn't help but smile. Alexander Hawthorne had always been untouchable, a man who seemed to glide through life without so much as a smudge on his reputation. But now, Victor held the match that could set his pristine image ablaze. Meanwhile, Evelyn was unaware that her world was about to become even more complicated. She was at her apartment, trying to focus on the latest policy briefing she'd been assigned, but her thoughts kept drifting. The fight with Alexander still lingered in her mind, and her frustration grew each time she replayed his hollow promises. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a call from a number she didn't recognize. Frowning, she hesitated before answering. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Ms. Grace," a deep voice replied. "This is Victor Langston. I believe we have some matters to discuss." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Victor Langston. She knew who he was, of course, Alexander's most prominent political rival, a man infamous for his cutthroat tactics. Why would he be calling her? "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her voice measured. "Oh, I think you do," Victor said smoothly. "I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. Let's meet. I'm sure you'd prefer to control your side of the story before it becomes public knowledge." Evelyn's grip tightened on her phone. I have nothing to say to you. Are you sure about that? Victor pressed. Because I have a feeling that once this story breaks, you'll wish you'd spoken to me first. He hung up before she could respond, leaving Evelyn staring at the phone, her pulse racing. She set it down slowly, her mind spinning. How had Victor found out? And what would he do with the information? Panic began to creep in, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She couldn't afford to lose her composure now. At the same time, Alexander was sitting in his private office at the Capitol building, unaware of the storm brewing around him. He was reviewing campaign strategy when his phone buzzed with a message from one of his aides: "Call me immediately. We have a problem." Alexander frowned, his unease growing as he dialed the number. His aide's voice was tense on the other end. "Sir, I've just received word that Victor Langston is digging into Evelyn Grace. He knows something." Alexander's chest tightened. "What exactly does he know?" "We don't have the full picture yet, but it's bad. He's already contacted her." Alexander leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment as he processed the information. The walls were closing in, faster than he had anticipated. He had always known this affair carried risks, but he had underestimated just how quickly those risks could spiral out of control. "Get me everything we have on Langston," he said finally, his voice low and firm. "If he wants to play dirty, so will we." But even as he gave the order, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. He had spent years building his career, his family, his reputation, brick by brick. Now, with Victor Langston circling like a vulture, he could feel it all beginning to crumble. Evelyn's pregnancy was beginning to show. Her once perfectly tailored blouses no longer fit as comfortably, and her slender figure now carried a slight curve that no longer went unnoticed by her colleagues. She had grown accustomed to the stolen glances, the awkward silences that followed her entry into a room, and the whispers that seemed to ripple through the halls wherever she walked. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the child she carried belonged to one of the most powerful men in the country. In her quiet Arlington apartment, Evelyn sat by the window, the soft morning light casting a warm glow over her. She placed a hand over her growing belly, feeling the faint flutter of life within her. It was a bittersweet sensation, a mix of awe and fear. She was preparing for motherhood, but she was also preparing for the inevitable fallout if the truth were ever revealed. She wasn't naive, she knew she couldn't hide this secret forever. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, interrupting her thoughts. It was Alexander. He had been more distant than usual lately, their conversations growing shorter, his promises increasingly hollow. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Evelyn," Alexander's voice came through the line, low and urgent. "We need to talk." "When?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Tonight. Usual place." Evelyn sighed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Is it important, or are you just trying to pacify me again?" There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet sigh. "It's important." That evening, Evelyn made her way to their secluded meeting spot, a small hotel tucked away in Georgetown. Alexander was already there when she arrived, standing by the window with his back to her, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call as she entered, turning to face her. His silver-streaked hair was slightly disheveled, and the lines on his face seemed deeper than usual. "You're late," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "I had things to do," Evelyn replied evenly, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Alexander glanced at her belly, his expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "Victor Langston knows about us," he said bluntly. Evelyn's breath caught. She had suspected as much after Victor's ominous phone call, but hearing Alexander confirm it sent a chill down her spine. "What does he want?" "To destroy me," Alexander said, pacing the room. "He's threatening to leak everything, our affair, the baby. If this gets out, Evelyn, my career is over. My family." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. Evelyn crossed her arms, her frustration finally boiling over. Your career. Your family. What about me? Do you have any idea what this has been like for me, carrying your child while you run off to keep up appearances with your perfect family? Evelyn, I'm doing everything I can to fix this, Alexander said, his voice rising. I've kept you out of the spotlight, I've provided for you. Provided for me? Evelyn snapped, her hazel eyes flashing with anger. You think throwing money at me and giving me a promotion is enough? You've barely been here. I've been dealing with this pregnancy alone while you hide behind your lies. Alexander's face darkened. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. No, Alexander, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Every day, I walk into that office knowing that people are watching me, judging me. I can't even look in the mirror without wondering if I'm making the biggest mistake of my life by trusting you. Her words hung in the air, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice quieter now. I know I've let you down. But I'm asking you to trust me, Evelyn. Let me handle this. I'll make it right. Evelyn shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Alexander. All I know is that I can't do this alone. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alexander standing there, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his crumbling world. Back at her apartment, Evelyn sat in the dim light of her living room, her hand resting on her belly. The baby moved, a tiny reminder of the life she was fighting for. Despite everything, she knew she had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for the child who would soon depend on her for everything. And as the weight of her situation pressed down on her, she resolved to take control of her future, no matter what it took. Catherine Hawthorne had always prided herself on her ability to read people, especially her husband. She had been by Alexander's side for over 20 years, enduring the pressures of public life, raising their children, and building their family's image as the gold standard of morality and stability. But lately, that image had started to crack, and so had Catherine's trust in her husband. It began with the late nights. At first, she believed him when he said the campaign required more of his time, that the election cycle was simply more demanding than usual. But then there were the hushed phone calls, the hastily silenced notifications, and the evasive answers whenever she asked him about his schedule. Catherine's instincts told her something was wrong. That evening, Catherine waited for Alexander in their spacious kitchen, the centerpiece of their elegant Bethesda home. The polished granite countertops gleamed under the pendant lights, and a bottle of red wine sat uncorked on the island, untouched. She stood by the sink, her auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her blue eyes fixed on the clock. Her two teenage children were upstairs, oblivious to the growing tension between their parents. The sound of the front door opening and closing echoed through the house, followed by Alexander's familiar footsteps. Catherine straightened, bracing herself as he entered the kitchen. He looked tired, his silver-streaked hair slightly mussed, and his tie loosened. "You're late," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "It's been a long day," Alexander replied, avoiding her gaze as he reached for a glass. "I had a meeting." "Another one?" Catherine asked, crossing her arms. "You've been working late almost every night. I've barely seen you this week." Alexander sighed, pouring himself a glass of wine. "Catherine, you know how demanding the campaign is. It's not just about me, it's about us. About the family." Catherine let out a bitter laugh. "The family? Alexander, you haven't been here long enough to know what's going on in this house. I'm the one holding everything together while you disappear into your meetings." She took a step closer, her voice lowering. "What's really going on, Alexander?" He froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Catherine said, her blue eyes narrowing. "I've seen the way you avoid me, the way you dodge questions. Something's not right, and I deserve to know the truth." Alexander set the glass down, running a hand through his hair. You're being paranoid, Catherine. I'm under a lot of pressure right now. You have to trust me. Trust you? She snapped. How can I trust you when you won't even look me in the eye and tell me the truth? The tension between them was palpable. For a moment, Alexander considered telling her everything. But the thought of Catherine knowing about Evelyn, and the baby, was too much. He couldn't bear to see the look of betrayal on her face, couldn't risk the fallout it would bring. I'm doing this for us, he said finally, his voice low and steady. Everything I'm doing is for the family, for our future. Catherine stared at him, her arms still crossed. I hope that's true, Alexander. Because if it's not, whatever you're hiding will come out eventually. And when it does, I don't think this family will survive it. With that, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Alexander standing alone, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Upstairs, their eldest son, a lanky 17-year-old with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, stood at the top of the stairs, listening to the argument below. He had heard his parents fight before, but this felt different. There was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that made him uneasy. Back in Arlington, Evelyn was also feeling the strain. She sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to an email she'd been dreading to send. It was addressed to her supervisor, requesting a temporary leave due to her health. She hated how vague it sounded, but the truth was far too complicated to explain. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she picked it up to see a message from Alexander, "We need to meet soon. Things are getting complicated." Evelyn set the phone down, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Things had been complicated from the moment this all started. She was tired of the secrecy, the judgmental stares at work, and most of all, tired of carrying the burden of their relationship on her own. As the night wore on, both Alexander and Evelyn found themselves staring out into the darkness, each consumed by the fractures in their lives. For Catherine, the cracks in her marriage had become impossible to ignore. For Alexander, the walls were closing in. And for Evelyn, the strain of her pregnancy and isolation was becoming too much to bear. Each of them was beginning to realize that their carefully constructed worlds were on the brink of collapse. Victor Langston was not a man who wasted opportunities, and the scandal surrounding Alexander Hawthorne was a gift wrapped in a bow. He had spent weeks gathering more evidence, ensuring every piece of the puzzle fit together perfectly. Now, it was time to strike. The meeting was set for a private dining room in a high-end steakhouse in downtown Washington, D.C., a location chosen for its exclusivity and discretion. Victor arrived early, his tailored charcoal suit impeccable, and took a seat at the head of the long mahogany table. The room was dimly lit, a single chandelier casting a soft glow over the polished surface of the table. A folder lay in front of him, its contents capable of bringing down one of the most revered figures in politics. Alexander entered a few minutes later, his expression tense but controlled. He had been summoned under the guise of discussing campaign strategy, but the look in Victor's eyes told him there was something far more insidious at play. Victor stood, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Alexander," he said smoothly, gesturing for him to sit. "Always a pleasure." "Victor," Alexander replied curtly, taking the seat across from him. "I assume this isn't just a friendly dinner." Victor's smile widened, a predator sensing weakness. "Straight to the point. I always admired that about you." He slid the folder across the table. "Let's call this an opportunity for clarity." Alexander's hand hovered over the folder before he finally opened it. His stomach dropped as he saw the contents: photographs of him and Evelyn entering the hotel together, emails exchanged between them, and a timeline meticulously crafted to highlight their affair. The final blow came in the form of a financial statement showing the transfer Alexander had arranged to secure Evelyn's promotion. "You've been busy," Alexander said, his voice measured but tight. Victor leaned back in his chair, his green eyes gleaming. "It's my job to stay informed. And as it turns out, you've been keeping quite the secret." Alexander closed the folder, his jaw clenched. What do you want? Ah, now we're getting somewhere. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You're going to withdraw from the election. Alexander let out a bitter laugh. You think you can bully me out of the race with this? Victor's expression darkened. Bully? No, Alexander. I'm giving you a choice. Step down quietly, and this stays between us. But if you don't, I'll release this to every major outlet in the country. And trust me, by the time they're finished with you, you won't just lose the election, you'll lose your family, your career, and whatever shred of dignity you have left. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alexander's mind raced, weighing his options. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, but this was a firestorm he couldn't see a way out of. Yet stepping down wasn't an option. It would mean admitting defeat, abandoning everything he had worked for. And what's in it for you? Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Victor smirked. A clean path to the nomination, of course. And the satisfaction of watching you fall. Alexander's fists clenched under the table. You're making a mistake, Victor. This will backfire on you. Victor chuckled. The only mistake here is yours, Alexander. You let your ego and your impulses get the better of you. Now, you're paying the price. The meeting ended with no resolution. Alexander left the steakhouse with the folder tucked under his arm, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, fear, and desperation. He knew Victor wasn't bluffing. The evidence was damning, and if it became public, it would destroy him. Later that night, Alexander sat in his private study at home, the folder open in front of him. Catherine had gone to bed hours ago, and the house was silent. He stared at the photographs, the emails, the damning proof of his betrayal. His mind raced with possible solutions, none of them viable. He picked up his phone and dialed Evelyn. She answered after a few rings, her voice cautious. Alexander? We have a problem, he said, his tone grim. Victor Langston knows everything. There was a long pause on the other end. How much does he know? Evelyn finally asked. Everything, Alexander replied. He's threatening to expose us unless I step down. Evelyn's breath hitched. And what are you going to do? I don't know yet, he admitted. But I need you to stay out of this. Let me handle it. Evelyn felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. Stay out of it? Alexander, this involves me too. My career, my reputation, my child, everything is at stake here. I know, Alexander said, his voice softening. And I'm trying to protect you. But you need to trust me. Trust you? Evelyn laughed bitterly. You've been saying that for months, and look where it's gotten us. Alexander had no response. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, the walls of his carefully constructed world closing in around him. As the night stretched on, both Alexander and Evelyn lay awake in their respective beds, consumed by the weight of Victor's ultimatum. Neither of them knew how much longer they could keep the truth from coming out, but they both knew one thing: the fallout would be devastating. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. The faint sound of rain tapped against the window, a dull rhythm matching the pounding in her head. She was exhausted, not just from the physical toll of her pregnancy, but from the weight of the secret she had carried for months. The stress had begun to manifest in subtle but unrelenting ways: restless nights, nausea beyond the pregnancy, and a gnawing sense of isolation. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the glow of Alexander's name lighting up the room. She stared at it for a moment, her emotions a tangled knot of anger, disappointment, and lingering affection. Finally, she picked up. What now? She asked, her voice sharp. We need to meet, Alexander said. His tone was clipped, betraying his own mounting stress. I have an idea about how to handle Langston. Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temple. What could you possibly have left to say, Alexander? Another promise you won't keep? This is different, he insisted. We can't talk about it over the phone. Fine, she said after a long pause. But this is the last time I'm letting you pull me into one of your plans. They met later that evening in the parking garage beneath one of the campaign's satellite offices. The sterile fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the concrete walls, and their voices echoed faintly in the cavernous space. Evelyn leaned against the hood of her car, arms crossed, as Alexander approached. He looked worn, the confident facade he usually wore cracking under the pressure. His tie was loose, his silver-streaked hair slightly disheveled. Thank you for coming, he said, though there was little gratitude in his tone. Get to the point, Alexander, Evelyn said. I'm tired of waiting for you to fix everything while my life falls apart. Alexander exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. Langston's bluffing. He doesn't have the guts to go public with this unless I push him. I've been working on discrediting him. If I can get him to back down. Stop, Evelyn interrupted, her voice rising. You've been saying you'll fix this for weeks, and where has it gotten us? Nowhere. He knows everything, Alexander. He's not bluffing. And you're fooling yourself if you think you can get out of this without facing the consequences. What do you want me to do, Evelyn? Alexander shot back. Throw my entire career away? Destroy my family? Is that what you want? What I want, Evelyn said, her voice trembling with restrained anger, is for you to stop pretending this is just about you. I have sacrificed everything for you. My reputation, my career. Do you have any idea what it's like to walk into work every day and see the way people look at me? To know that I'm carrying this child alone while you hide behind your perfect life? Alexander fell silent, his jaw tightening. Evelyn took a step closer, her hazel eyes blazing. You don't get to make this about your campaign, your family, or your image anymore. This is about me, Alexander. Me and this baby. And I won't let you keep controlling the narrative. What are you saying? He asked warily. I'm saying I'm done waiting for you to do the right thing, Evelyn said. I'm done being your secret, your scapegoat, your afterthought. If you won't face the truth, I will. Alexander's eyes widened. Evelyn, don't do this. If you go public, it'll ruin everything, for both of us. Maybe it will, she said, her voice steady now. But at least I'll be free. Free from your lies, your excuses, your empty promises. She turned and walked away, leaving Alexander standing alone in the cold, empty garage. As she drove back to her apartment, her mind raced. She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear, she couldn't keep living like this. It was time to take control, to tell her story on her own terms. Back in his office, Alexander sat in silence, his head in his hands. He knew Evelyn was serious, and for the first time, he felt truly powerless. The walls of his carefully constructed life were closing in, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For Evelyn, the decision to act felt like a small spark of liberation in the darkness. She was tired of being a pawn in Alexander's game, tired of sacrificing her own agency for the sake of his ambitions. She had spent months waiting for him to fix things, to step up and take responsibility. But now she realized she didn't need him to take control of her future, she could do it herself. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Alexander's private office in the Capitol building, but the warmth it cast did little to thaw the tension in the room. Alexander sat at his desk, his head in his hands, while his campaign manager, a wiry man with sharp features and a perpetually furrowed brow, paced back and forth. We're out of time, Alexander, the manager said, his voice clipped. Langston's camp is moving. We're hearing whispers about a press conference tomorrow morning. If he goes public with this, it's over. Alexander looked up, his blue eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. Do we have anything on him? Anything we can use to discredit him? The campaign manager shook his head. Nothing substantial. And even if we did, it wouldn't matter. He has hard evidence, Alexander. Photographs, emails, financial records, everything he needs to make this stick. Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of his predicament pressing down on him. His entire career, everything he had built, was hanging by a thread. His family, his reputation, his legacy, it would all be gone if Victor Langston followed through on his threat. As the campaign manager left the office, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was Catherine. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Alexander, her voice was sharp, cutting through his fog of despair. I'm coming to your office. We need to talk. Before he could respond, she hung up. Alexander exhaled heavily, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Catherine's tone left no doubt, she knew something was wrong, and she wasn't going to let him evade her questions this time. An hour later, Catherine walked into his office, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored navy blazer and pencil skirt, her auburn hair swept into a sleek bun. But her sharp blue eyes were filled with a fury Alexander hadn't seen before. "Close the door," she said, her voice cold. Alexander complied, bracing himself as she took a seat across from him. "I've been patient," Catherine began, her tone controlled but deadly. "I've ignored the late nights, the evasive answers, the constant excuses. But I'm done pretending I don't see what's happening." "Catherine," Alexander started, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Don't lie to me." Her voice cracked slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "I've given you everything, Alexander. My trust, my loyalty, my life. And this is how you repay me." Alexander's stomach churned. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Catherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Who is she?" His silence was answer enough. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her composure crumbling for just a moment as she fought back tears. "Do you love her?" Alexander shook his head quickly. "It's not like that, Catherine. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." "And the baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alexander froze. He hadn't realized how much she already knew. "I didn't want this to happen," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I've been trying to fix it, to protect all of us." Catherine let out a bitter laugh. "Protect us? The only person you've been protecting is yourself." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for once, he had no defense. She stood, her movements sharp and deliberate. "You've destroyed this family, Alexander. And when this gets out, and it will, you'll be standing in the ashes alone." With that, she walked out, leaving Alexander staring at the closed door, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn sat in her apartment, her nerves fraying as she finalized the statement she planned to deliver. She knew this would be the most difficult thing she'd ever done, but she also knew it was necessary. For months, she had allowed Alexander to control the narrative, to keep her hidden in the shadows while he clung to his power. But now, with Langston closing in and Alexander's indecision threatening to consume them both, Evelyn had decided to act. Her phone buzzed with a message from Alexander, "Don't do anything rash. Let me handle this." She stared at the words, her jaw tightening. It was always the same, "Let me handle this." But he never did. This time, Evelyn knew, she couldn't wait for him to act. She had to take control of her own future. As the hours passed, the tension mounted. Catherine's confrontation with Alexander had shaken him to his core, and Victor Langston's press conference loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. Evelyn, too, felt the pressure building, her resolve tested by the enormity of what she was about to do. That night, as the city lights glittered outside her window, Evelyn stood in front of her mirror, practicing her statement. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for her child, for her truth. No matter what happened tomorrow, she knew she was ready to face it. The grand ballroom at the National Convention Center was packed with Washington's elite. The event, billed as a celebration of party unity, had drawn politicians, donors, and media figures from across the country. The air buzzed with energy, the soft hum of conversation and laughter punctuated by the occasional clink of champagne glasses. At the front of the room, a grand podium stood under a glittering chandelier, the party emblem displayed prominently behind it. Alexander Hawthorne sat at the head table, his face an unreadable mask. Dressed impeccably in a dark tailored suit, he carried the weight of the evening with him. His wife, Catherine, sat beside him, her expression composed but distant. She hadn't spoken to him since their confrontation the day before, and her presence now felt like an obligation rather than solidarity. Victor Langston was also in the room, seated a few tables away, his green eyes gleaming with anticipation. He had delayed his press conference, knowing that tonight's event would be the perfect backdrop for Alexander's impending downfall. He relished the thought of watching his rival squirm. But the spotlight didn't fall on Victor, or even on Alexander. It fell on Evelyn Grace. The crowd hushed as she approached the podium, her emerald green dress flowing as she moved with a quiet confidence. Her light brown skin glowed under the chandeliers, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek bun. She placed her hands on the podium, her hazel eyes scanning the room with purpose. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. I stand here not as a politician or a member of this esteemed party, but as someone with a truth that needs to be told." Alexander stiffened in his seat, his heart pounding. Catherine turned to look at him, her blue eyes narrowing as understanding dawned. "For months, I have carried a secret," Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. "A secret that involves a man many of you hold in the highest regard. Tonight, I can no longer stay silent." The room was deathly quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. "I am pregnant," Evelyn said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "And the father of my child is Alexander Hawthorne." Gasps erupted across the room. Victor leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. Catherine's composure shattered, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to Alexander, who sat frozen, his face ashen. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "I am not here to destroy anyone's life," she said, her voice softening. "I am here because the truth matters. For too long, we've allowed lies and hypocrisy to dictate our lives. It's time we face the consequences of our actions." The crowd erupted into chaos, whispers, accusations, and the flash of cameras as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Alexander rose from his seat, his expression a mix of fury and despair, but before he could approach the podium, Evelyn stepped back, her gaze locking onto his for a brief, poignant moment. "Thank you," she said simply before walking off the stage. The rest of the evening was a blur. Alexander was swarmed by reporters, his carefully constructed image unraveling in real time. Catherine left without a word, her head held high but her heart broken. Victor watched it all unfold, savoring the victory that had been handed to him without lifting a finger. Evelyn, meanwhile, slipped out a side exit, her heart pounding. For the first time in months, she felt free. She had reclaimed her voice, her story, and her future. Whatever came next, she knew she could face it. The fallout was immediate and devastating. By morning, Alexander Hawthorne's name was plastered across every major news outlet. His campaign was in freefall, his family in turmoil. Catherine filed for divorce, while Victor Langston capitalized on the scandal, positioning himself as the moral alternative. But Evelyn was not without her own challenges. The public's reaction to her revelation was mixed, some viewed her as a hero for exposing the truth, while others painted her as a homewrecker. Still, she held her head high, focusing on preparing for the arrival of her child. As for Alexander, his career was in ruins, but the story was far from over. Evelyn's revelation had ignited a media frenzy, and questions about his other secrets began to surface. What else had Alexander been hiding? And how far would he go to salvage what little remained of his legacy? If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to Epic Emotion Stories for more gripping tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. This is just the beginning. What other secrets lie beneath Alexander Hawthorne's polished exterior? And how will Evelyn navigate her new life in the public eye? Stay tuned for the next chapter in this unforgettable saga, where the truth is never as simple as it seems. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Let this story remind us that truth, though painful, is the first step toward freedom.